So in order to get started, let's just talk about some of the major impacts and challenges that we have as far as the coronavirus is concerned. We have supply chain issues, potential workforce reductions, getting people to work. And there's two items with that particular thing. One is because of the unemployment benefits that a lot of the workers are getting. They could be greater than the amount of money they would be getting if they went to work. And specifically is the mass transportation, especially here in New York City. There's still a lot of people are concerned about taking mass transportation, and obviously that can have a detrimental impact on getting workers to the job site. And again, we have workers just in general afraid coming to the job site because of contacting the coronavirus. The contractors themselves are faced with major issues as it relates to contract and insurance, force majeure clause, builder's all risk policy interpretations, financial implications, insurance premium increases, workers' compensation claims, litigation that may happen, project schedule increases, and major disputes that may occur. And of paramount importance now is a potential second wave as it relates to the coronavirus. Are we concerned primarily about having a second wave come in? And what kind of impact is it going to have on our industry? When we look at the coronavirus and we look at to see what can happen as far as the future is concerned, and how our industry are going to address these issues. I believe that our industry is going to make some drastic changes in order to account not only with the coronavirus, but going ahead into the future of how the industry is going to address special issues that they have never addressed before. So a lot of the methods that are standard in the industry may no longer be valid. And we have to try to look at ways primarily to change our methodology. The workers now have to maintain their distance, all right? A lot of times what contractors are doing now and subcontractors are looking to have workers start at different times. In fact, some contractors are looking at multiple shift scenario. So you may have where one shift starts at 8 o'clock in the morning and maybe the second shift starts at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. All this is trying to maintain that distance so that there is no transfer of the coronavirus from one individual to the next. We have scenarios where the hoist elevator has changed now. Before we could stick 15 to 20 workers in a hoist. Now you're going to probably have to do only 5 and 7 so that you have that separation. The tools that are used by one worker and may have been used by other workers have to be cleaned after each use. There's going to be multiple toilets and hand wash areas, more than you normally had beforehand. And all these factors have a tremendous impact on cost and productivity. So we're going to have to evaluate more efficient ways to fabricate and install major components that we use in the construction industry. Well, when we look at the financial impact, and this is true for the industry as a whole, when you look at this graph that we have here, if there was no coronavirus to deal with, you see the black line and we see a great increase in the amount of construction that was going to occur prior to this pandemic starting. If we look at the orange chart and then we look at the worst case scenario, we see what kind of major impact construction is going to have because of this pandemic. If in fact there is a way to resolve a lot of these problems that we're going to have, we may see a delay in starting construction and then eventually come back. If there is a second wave, or if we have problems associated with construction today and how we deal with those particular problems, then there's going to be a major reduction in the amount of construction that's going to take place. And everything that we see, especially on this chart, contractors, developers are now reviewing and evaluating and trying to come up with all alternatives, primarily to address all the issues that may occur. Some of the financial impact that we're looking at when we look at the pandemic primarily is a lot of projects have in fact been delayed, which causes a deferment of capital for rent or for selling a particular project by a developer. There's going to be probably an increase in construction costs due to extended schedules, and schedules are definitely going to be extended because productivity is going to decrease. Why? Primarily, you don't have the workforce working in concert with one another. There has to be separations. There has to be constant cleaning. All these factors contribute to additional cost. Cost for general conditions, for contractors, and extended rentals for equipment like cranes, hoists, and scaffolding, and toilets have to be taken into account. Cost of materials with cost escalation. Replacement of personnel who contacted the coronavirus. You have scenarios, you have a worker, maybe a very skilled worker who's working on the job site, and then unfortunately contacts the coronavirus. That means that we're going to have to replace that particular individual with maybe a less skilled individual, or maybe somebody who is not that familiar with the project. So that's going to take time for that individual to take over the responsibility of that individual who had the coronavirus, and to make sure that that individual is skilled in order for them to do the job. Again, it's a cost and time factor. Some contractors and subcontractors may go out of business because projects were delayed, cash flow was such that they were not getting money in a timely manner. Even though they may have been paid some money by the government, this is not going to hold them through to the end of the job. And as we all know in our business, when we start up a job and we submit our requisitions, in most cases, those requisitions sometimes are not paid within the 30-day time period. Sometimes they go to 60 or 120 days. That is going to have a major impact on our industry. And once the pandemic has subsided, if it does, the need for material creates a supply chain shortage. Production of material will take time and create a cost versus demand escalation. With the supply chain from China interrupted, domestic products will again be used. This may be more costly alternative. Remobilization of the site takes time, increases your schedule, and again, increases the cost of the particular project. So here we have a scene where we have a large number of cranes being used on a project. If these particular projects, and these projects were delayed, primarily these were office buildings, the cost for those cranes comes into question. Well, who pays for those particular costs during this hiatus? And we're talking about probably 3, maybe 4 months delay. And these cranes can cost anywhere between $100,000 and $150,000 per month. So the question comes out is who's going to pay for those cranes? Because now, in most cases, we're going to have to extend the schedule by 3 to 4 months. And somebody's going to have to pay for the rental of those particular cranes. These are issues that contractors or subcontractors are having right now. And will it eventually be resolved to everybody's satisfaction? And probably the answer is no, that some people are going to pay more money than others. And in most cases, most people are not going to be satisfied. However, in our industry, we have to work together. We have to negotiate to make sure that everybody is well taken care of and we come out with a satisfactory solution. So when we talk about cost and we talk about the protocol primarily that's going to be instituted here primarily for the coronavirus, there is a whole new health protocol that contractors and subcontractors have to follow. This includes protective gear, wearing masks besides the standard PPE that most contractors and subcontractors, their workers have to wear. So now we have additional protective gear. Whether in fact this additional protective gear primarily is going to impact the productivity of the workers is something that we will not know. We have to create check-in areas where temperature sensors are going to be implemented, and everybody coming onto the job site is going to have to be tested for their temperature. Now, there's been a large controversy about this regarding whether in fact temperature sensors do a valid job or not. The contentious part of this is that when you take somebody's temperature, you're actually taking only the skin temperature. You're not taking the core temperature, is what you're really interested in. So until something comes up that could do a better job of measuring the effective temperature of workers, it's going to be a plus or minus situation whether a worker is in fact has the coronavirus. And there are certain workers who may be asymptomatic and you may not know whether in fact they carry the coronavirus or not. This is something hopefully we will find out. Now again, what a lot of the health professionals are trying to do and implement is to test more people, especially if you find out that a particular worker may have had the coronavirus. Hopefully with the individuals who are going to check all the people that they've been in contact with will hopefully reduce the number of people who will be contacting the coronavirus. We have to administrate all these workers with a temperature and health history. We have to increase the number of toilets. Before, we may have had toilets on every other floor or maybe every 3 floors if we're working in a high-rise building. Now, what may be required, we may have to have toilets possibly on every floor. And we have to have some kind of wash stations where, in fact, the workers can wash up, probably on a constant basis. And this also is going to add cost because we're going to have to add the number of toilets and the number of wash stations that we have. Sanitization of the work areas and tools now is becoming a factor. We never had to be concerned about that in the past. The inefficiency with the separation of workers, we briefly talked about that. It's going to be very difficult on how in fact you do that. I was on a job site the other day watching workers performing their task, and I noticed that most of these workers were not separated by the 6-foot protocol, and that's going to be a problem in our industry because where you have workers who are not separating, you're going to have more people contacting the virus, which is going to have an impact on the amount of work that is done. Again, we talked about the replacement of sick workers and the loss of productivity because now we're bringing in a worker who may not have the skill set for that particular job or has to learn what has to be done for that particular job. And then you may have the shutdown of a project if too many workers contact the coronavirus. You know, this has happened with a lot of the food plants, especially the meatpacking plants where they were working in close confines of each other, and a lot of the workers contacted the coronavirus. Now, again, in our industry, when we're working on a large project and you may have 400 to 500 workers working on that particular job, we may be faced with the same scenario. So again, we hope that doesn't happen, and we hope that people are taking and doing the due diligence to make sure that we minimize the amount of spread of this virus. Are we going to totally eliminate it? I tend to doubt it, but we got to try and find ways primarily to minimize this particular problem. Again, the loss of productivity with the reduction in work areas and reduction in crew sizes is going to have a major impact primarily on the cost of the project and the schedule. Movement of workers has to be orchestrated to increase contact area, thus making the workforce less efficient. And some firms are hiring protocol managers to check temperatures of workers and to make sure the workers are adhering to the PPE and distance requirements. Also making sure that they're washing their hands on a constant basis, making sure when they're eating in one particular area, making sure when they get on the hoist that there's complete separation and the number of workers that are in fact getting on the hoist is greatly reduced, as I mentioned to you before. OSHA and municipal governments are implementing new health standards. And if firms do not comply, they could shut down the project. If you have the building department like here in New York City, that's going to be responsible for making sure that contractors and subcontractors adhere to the latest protocols. If they find out that those particular subcontractors and workers are not adhering to that, they may shut the job down. That's going to have a major impact on our industry. So OSHA has come up with a standard. This is a whole list. Obviously, I'm not going to go through this, but anybody who wants to find out about what OSHA standards are, you can go online and get that information to find out what their protocols are in regard to construction workforce. We also have New York City, DOB, who has established standards. And I'm sure as June 8th comes around, it gets closer and closer, and more work is going to start in New York City as far as construction is concerned. The DOB is going to send out more regulations based upon maybe past practices with other contractors, or maybe enhance the requirements and what kind of information has to be submitted. I'm sure, knowing the building department, that there's going to be an increase in paperwork as to find out primarily if in fact somebody does have the coronavirus, what kind of forms have to be filled out to advise the building department and the health department, those employees who in fact have contacted it, and also probably a list of people who were in close contact to those individuals as well. So again, this is more information about what the DOB and the health department is looking at. This happens to be the city of Fort Lauderdale. Every city in the United States has developed some kind of protocol in order to handle the coronavirus on a construction site. Again, here is something, again, trying to separate the workers 6 feet away. Again, my own opinion of this is I think that this is going to be very difficult to implement. I think that workers in general have to work in close concert with each other, and the separation, just because of the nature of construction, is going to be extremely difficult. And those workers are going to be difficult to adhere to these requirements. So it's something, again, that our industry has to look at, find a better way to do this. There is now technology available that individuals wear, almost like a wristwatch. And as soon as they get close to another individual who's wearing the same device, an alarm goes off. I mean, that may be fine. How practical that is going to be very interesting to see and evaluate. I hope it works. Again, we want to make sure that we're safe, workers are safe, everybody who's involved with construction is in fact safe. However, when we look at the construction industry, and as I mentioned to you before, primarily, is this really what's going to happen on a construction site? All right. We have all these individuals here. We have those three individuals on the right, primarily, who are discussing something about the project itself. Number one, they're not separated by 6 feet. And number two, they're not wearing masks. Whether in fact that will continue or not, we'll only have to see and wait for time, and wait what the position is going to be taken by the building department and how strict they're going to be. My own feeling is if the DOB comes around and inspect the job site, they're going to mandate that everybody on that job site has, in fact, some type of mask that they're wearing. And they're going to say, try to separate the workers, which again, I think as a practical matter is going to be extremely difficult. Even though where you can, we should try to implement that as well. Same thing with the number of toilets. Here we show one toilet. We're going to need many more toilets. You know, if you had 4 or 5 toilets before on a job site, you're probably going to need triple the amount. And you're going to have somebody going around cleaning those toilets to make sure that there's no problem associated with that, and to make sure there's sufficient number of workstations, so the wash stations, so the workers can go around and wash their hands in a reasonable manner. Again, all this, as I mentioned before, has a major impact on productivity, because as soon as you have an individual leaving their work station and going down to either wash their hands or go to the toilet, primarily, that is a productivity issue. So obviously productivity is going to decrease until this pandemic ends, primarily. With the supply chain, there was a lot of products coming in from China, which had a great impact on the construction of a lot of projects. And now we're faced with the latest trade disputes. This could make the situation even worse. When the coronavirus spread to Europe, and especially to Italy, to Spain, a vast number of construction products were being deferred because a lot of the factories were closed. A lot of those factories are starting to open up, but it's probably going to be a slow process, because they are also faced with the scenario of a second wave, and they are taking new methods primarily to separate the workforce in the factory environment. By doing that, that increases the productivity of the product that they're trying to produce. In the US, we're faced with a similar type of situation. The factories are going to be slow to deliver product, again, especially with the new safety protocols being implemented at the workplace. And then architects and the related consultants are evaluating other products that could readily be available, but probably with some kind of cost implication. I mean, this is one of the reasons that contractors and subcontractors and developers were looking at foreign products, because in essence, those foreign products were cheaper from those particular locations than they were here in the US. Now, whether in fact the US is now going to change their methodology of how they put things together, whether their workforce is going to be such that the product could be made cheaper than it could be made either in China or some other location throughout the world, only time will tell, and we'll have to see. Legal issues. We have the force majeure clause. Again, are the contractors protected for extended schedule due to the pandemic? Builders all risk policy. Are contractors protected from loss due to the pandemic? Most policies have an exclusion. The question comes out, would the contractor be reimbursed for additional general conditions for the delay in the project? This is a scenario that a lot of the contractors that I've talked to are addressing right now. They want to see how, in fact, they could possibly recoup some of their general conditions, if that's at all possible. A lot of times the developer would be willing to share some of that loss with the contractor, and only time will tell how this all shakes out in the future. There's been business interruption lawsuits for those contractors, subcontractors who have that particular type of insurance. However, there's already been lawsuits started with that. And it's going to be very interesting how that all turns out. And we have lawsuits from workers that have already started who've contacted the coronavirus on the job site. They're going back and suing the subcontractors and the contractors because either they were hospitalized for an extended period of time, or unfortunately, some people have lost their lives and their families are now coming back and instituting lawsuits. So this is another cost implication that we have to deal with in our particular industry. The force majeure clause, as I talked about before, usually it's excluded primarily because of an event that was not controlled by either party, usually referred to as act of God. This included hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, and above normal windstorms. The party who wants to invoke the force majeure clause, they must notify the party within a specific period of time. This is usually included in the notification clause of the contract. This is extremely important. Courts have made this clear, even if the contractor was correct and did not follow the notification clause. So if in fact you did not follow the notification clause, a lot of courts have taken issue with this, even though you may be right as a contractor or subcontractor, but you did not follow the requirements of the contract and you could have lost the case. With the coronavirus, there's no legal precedent as to whether the force majeure clause is applicable. The states or the courts may have to decide. And again, the interpretation of the force majeure clause can have major consequences for a contractor. Liquidated damages is another area where contractors and subcontractors have to look at. For those people who are not that familiar with liquidated damages clause, primarily it states that you as the contractor have to finish a job by a date certain if the delay was not caused by other parties. But if the delay was caused by you, in this particular case, supposedly by the coronavirus, then you would have to pay damages to a developer. So it may be a day-by-day situation. The liquidated damage clause may state in the contract that for every day delayed, you have to pay me as a developer $1,000 per day until you reach a certain limitation. In most cases, it has to do with either getting a C of O, but in most cases, usually a TCO. So if the TCO has now been pushed out 3 or 4 months, you as a contractor and maybe as a subcontractor, you would have to pay the liquidated damages. Again, this issue has to be addressed. And hopefully, maybe the courts or the state will address this particular issue and come with a good resolution. Sometimes the AIA documents may protect the contractor from delays. You got to look at section 8.3.1 of the AIA documents to see if in fact there is any scenario which could protect you. Insurance, in most cases, the general insurance policies do not cover you for any pandemics. Builders or risks do not cover you for pandemics. Again, business interruption insurance does not cover, right? The only way these issues can be resolved if the US government or state governments steps in to clarify and or mandate certain relief. In either case, what's going to happen, I think that we're going to find in our industry that insurance premiums are going to increase because I think there's going to be a lot of lawsuits. And even if in fact we find that some insurance company will pay for this pandemic for any type of scenario, I think that the insurance industry wants to get back to some financial viability. And the only way primarily they're going to do that is to look to increase the premium. So I would say, look to see an increase in your premiums as far as insurance is concerned. Well, we got to look at various type of opportunities that may occur now that we're into this pandemic. So the methods that we use for construction that were standard in the industry has to be reevaluated. One way to achieve this is to consider more extensive use of modular construction, have more components fabricated in a factory environment. Separation of the workers and sanitation of work areas are easier to achieve than on a job site. This is in a modular factory. We get better quality control of construction components and possible reduction in cost as well. So again, the modular components will reduce the amount of contact that workers have with each other, reduces the time for installation. Of course, all the components are put together outside the construction environment. We have better quality control, less punch lists, less time for delivery of components, thus less time for workers to have the contact with one another when they deliver components. You may have a piece of mechanical equipment there may be major components associated with that mechanical equipment. If everything comes in a one unit, then there's less pieces that we have to handle and less contact with other people when we're handling those particular pieces. And we can increase overall productivity, which is now reduced because of the various phasing that's going to take place with the various construction elements. So when we talk about modular, and a lot of our industry has embraced modular now, for instance, we talk about exterior facades. We used to use what was called a stick system, where we had the mullions and then we placed the glass inside the mullions. Well, now we have these panelized system where everything comes together. The mullions and the glass come together and you install the total component. We have prefabrication of electrical boxes with outlet and BX. The individual who fabricates this measures the distance from the electrical panel to an outlet, and this is all prefabricated. So when the electrician comes, all he has to do primarily is hook up to the electrical panel and install a box. The BX is already there. The electrician doesn't have to put the BX, measure it, it's all there. It all comes as one component. Our industry has done this in the past, roughing of plumbing pipes. All these systems would come in as one unit and it would be installed by the plumber. Instead of each individual unit with the no-hub pipe, the pipe itself all comes separately. This would all come as one complex scenario. Stairs, instead of putting in various pieces of stairs where we can, maybe we can install one stair that's already fabricated and maybe do the installation work. Instead of putting in stringers and risers and everything else independently, we can do this all at one time. Another way to reduce this is using precast concrete components. We don't do a lot of that here in New York City. I know for buildings that are being installed primarily for low-income housing, they're looking at this scenario, and this may be a good way, again, to try to increase productivity on a construction site. Use of BIM, building information modeling. There's another area that should be considered. Primarily, it will increase productivity. With using BIM, we evaluate the various phases of the project and determine the most expeditious way to put components together. And BIM models can be used to develop a project in real time. So we can basically go through the project, see where we can increase productivity, but where we can separate the trades without impacting other parts of the project as well. It's a fantastic tool to use. We could use BIM with schedule to see, again, how we can increase the capability of putting components together and trying to reduce the contact with various numbers of workers. Use of robotics. This is something that our industry has not embraced yet, and it's something that should be embraced. It's currently used in manufacturing, especially fabrication of automobiles. Simple functions such as drywall, painting may be an ideal area where robotics can be installed. The construction industry, because of the coronavirus, may be forced to evaluate outside the box alternative for achieving increased productivity. And the use of robotics may be one way to look at it. So you may be familiar with this particular photograph. This was the photograph of iron workers sitting on a beam as they're constructing one of the buildings for the Rockefeller Center. Obviously, the so-called protocol at that time was not any problem with wearing safety harnesses, hard hats, etc. Obviously, that's changed. And now we see the same scenario, however, where we're using robotics. Whether this is far-fetched, maybe yes, maybe no, but it's something that our industry has to review and evaluate and address. Here we have a robot that lays bricks. This is in production. It's been used, and it's a methodology that, in fact, seems to be fairly successful. Along with that, a lot of industries, especially in home building, are looking at 3D printing to print various components of a building. We may look at that alternative. to maybe manufacture products by using a 3D printer that we can bring in job site and eventually install. Putting up drywall, can use robots to do that. All these are possible. We have to start thinking outside the box. We have to start putting some money into research, find out better ways to construct our buildings. And I think now is a fantastic opportunity to look at that as well. So positive side of now that we have of looking with the coronavirus is, number one, interest rates are down. Thus, if you can find financial institutions that will lend you the money, your charges for building a project are going to be reduced. Construction startups may be delayed. Thus, those contractors who start work immediately can gain an advantage in obtaining the proper material before other contractors get involved. Labor force, the same thing. You may be in a position to get more skilled workers because maybe some of the projects have stopped or been delayed. Warmer weather is here, and this means greater productivity. The dynamics of the industry is going to change in regard to working in a healthier environment, and the construction industry must adapt to new normal and develop new means and methods for the construction project. Again, if we are smart and our industry leaders are smart, we're going to start thinking outside the box to find out ways to reduce our costs and increase productivity, even though we have these latest protocols primarily that decrease productivity. So the best is yet to come. Keep dreaming, hoping, and planning. And we hope that primarily that we can develop a vaccine and develop for this pandemic so that we can get back to doing our job the way we want to. But hopefully we can gain an advantage of this, and we can start looking at the box that we normally use for construction and find ways primarily to increase our productivity. Even though with the new protocol will probably decrease our productivity, we have to find means and methods to increase our productivity. So thank you. Does anybody have any questions about anything that has been raised? Yes, Michelle.
When they do the testing for the thermometer gun, is that only at the beginning of the day, or is that, let's say, beginning of the day and midday?
Well, some contractors are looking at doing it more than one time a day. They're thinking about doing, some of the contractors that I talk to, we're talking about not only doing it at when they enter the site, but also possibly doing it during the lunchtime as well.
And how does that factor in when it's like a hot day and people are sweaty?
Well, this is the problem with the thermometers. I mentioned to you before, with these type of thermometers that they're using, and I'm sure that technology may change, you're primarily testing the temperature of the skin. You're not testing the temperature, the core temperature, which is the key element. And I'm sure technology and a lot of industries are looking at better ways basically to take temperature at personnel. I don't think we've gotten to that yet. So for now, we have to work with what we have today, and hopefully that'll prove in the future.
I have another question, if I can.
Sure.
So being that the job market was competitive before, but now it's insanely competitive, other than boning up on certifications or the latest software, how can one position themselves to be picked for a job versus somebody else?
I mean, that's difficult to say. It depends what your expertise is. I mean, I know that you have the expertise in project manager. I think that if you go in and tell them that you understand the protocol, you've read everything that's been put out by OSHA and everything that's put out by the NYC Department of Buildings, and you understand the protocol and what has to be implemented on the job site, I think that would be a plus for an individual who would be trying to be working for a contractor, because I think what's going to happen in today's environment with the coronavirus is that they're going to be looking for people, maybe some kind of administrator who's going to be responsible to make sure that the workers are following the protocols that have been established by OSHA and by the building department. And I think that if you have an expertise in that area by reading stuff and becoming familiar with it, and maybe taking some course, I think you're going to be in a better position than some other people.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Anybody else? Come on, it's a lot of material that we covered.
Richard, we have some questions in the chat function.
Okay, let me get to the chat function here. Okay. Why do you think construction has been very slow in adapting new technology? And even when some develop new technology like panels, people want strong and time-tested techniques and are not ready to accept changes. How can we obtain the behavior change, specifically homeowners? Okay, it's a good question. Several years ago, I did a paper on the productivity in the construction industry. And for people who are familiar with me, have heard this say many, many times, that our industry has not changed drastically since the time of the pyramids. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the way we do construction today is very similar to the time of the pyramids, because when you look at how we put a building together, it's all put together by tradespeople. And when you look at the construction of the pyramids, it was done exactly the same way, by pyramid, by workforce. And we haven't changed. Now, why have we not changed anything? Because our industry, not only here in New York, throughout the United States, does not give a lot of money to research. There are other countries like Japan, for instance, and Germany, who support technology in the construction industry. We are not willing to do that here. When you look at our industry before the pandemic and the amount of money that we were spending on construction, we were spending on construction over $1 trillion. And we look at the research that has been done for construction, it's infinitesimal compared to other industries. So we are having a hard time changing. Now, the question is why? Very easy answer. Our industry, like myself, is made up of a lot of elderly, if I'm using the right terminology. And we are used to doing certain things in a certain way. And we're not ready to make that change. Very difficult for us to make that change. I can tell you several years ago, when computers came into existence and we had iPads, how many contractors that I talked to refused to implement that type of device on the construction industry. It took a long time for them to accept it. Now, in New York, and this is changing, we have unions. There is a lot of union protocol that's being done, all right, and they don't want any major changes. It took a long time for those people who may not be familiar with no-hub piping to change from cast iron pipe, where we use lead and oakum to connect the pipe, to use no-hub piping. It took a long time to convince everybody that this was the way to go. And eventually, the union realized that we had to make the change. Now, there's a lot of contractors out there that understand that in order to increase their productivity and increase their profitability, they are making changes slowly but surely. And now I think is the opportunity for all contractors and subcontractors to look at different ways of how we put a building together. Let's get away from the style of using the pyramid method, of using a lot of tradespeople to do something, and look at other technologies primarily. Now is the perfect opportunity. However, we got to convince our industry primarily to take the first step, and maybe they'll be forced to do this. Maybe they'd be forced to do this, considering the fact that maybe they're going to lose money and they have to look at ways to make up that money. And one of the ways they could do that primarily is to find ways to increase productivity. And maybe one of the ways to increase productivity primarily is to find other methods to do certain things. Did that answer the question, or do you still have something else? Okay. Somebody asked, what is an AIA document? An AIA document is the American Institute of Architects document in our industry, primarily for contracts between, say, architects, developers, or architects and developers, between the owner and the contractor. The so-called standard, there are other contracts that they use. The other standard is the AIA document, the American Institute of Architects. So everybody in the construction industry primarily uses this. There's other documents that they use, but I'd say that predominantly they use the AIA document. Anybody else have any other questions?
We have a hand raised. I'll allow them to speak.
Okay, go ahead. Joseph?
Hey, I had a question. Do you think there's any particular asset class that might be less susceptible to the risks that you've discussed? And do you think that'll drive kind of a shift in developers trying to target certain deals that might be sort of less susceptible to these risks?
Are you talking about as far as the population of the contractors? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I guess developers particularly, I'd say.
But when you talk about a developer is going to develop a project, and that project has to be constructed by workers. I'm not too sure what you mean from the developer's perspective as far as their own people.
I guess if you think that, say Class A office might have the greatest risk of contractors being on top of each other and it has the most nuances, they might shift towards something like industrial, where there's already more of a modular component that developers are using.
I think if you read the newspapers, and actually this was happening before the pandemic started, I think that there was a shift into industrial construction. Why? Primarily because we have the Amazons and the Walmarts primarily that are delivering product, and they need a distribution center. And the number of distribution centers has been increasing appreciably. Now, from a developer's perspective, what's going to happen as far as home building is concerned, as far as commercial is concerned, and even residential, I think what I've read is that it's going to have a major impact, because when we look at workers actually working in an office environment, a lot of the stuff that you're reading today is that a lot of the businesses are going primarily letting their workers work from home. Now, whether this is going to have a dramatic impact in the New York marketplace will be interesting to see. But I think that you're going to find out that a lot of people and businesses who have workers and have worked in an office environment are now going to switch over. And there's many reasons for that. First of all, real estate is expensive. Renting space is expensive. Constructing out the space is expensive. So an individual who owns a business is going to look at ways to save costs. And maybe one of the ways they're going to do this primarily is have workers work from home on an online environment. So I think there's going to be a dramatic change in as far as the amount of construction that you see for commercial buildings and residential. I think we're going to have an impact, because right now I think that people don't have a lot of money to either rent space or buy space in a residential unit as well. So only time will tell primarily what's going to happen, the dynamics of the financial part of our industry because of this pandemic. Did I answer the question, or did you have other clarifications?
No, I think you did. Yep, I think you did answer the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Come on, there must be other questions that you have.
We have a question in the Q&A tab.
Okay. Do you think high-rise residential construction, hotel construction will decrease, and we should be expecting more affordable housing and infrastructure projects in the city? Well, I wish I had a crystal ball to indicate what's going to happen. I have a feeling that the high-rise residential construction and even the hotel construction is going to be impacted for an extended period of time. I think, again, as I mentioned before, the high-rise residential construction, I think, is going to be impacted because there's going to be a lot of people out there who either lost their jobs or maybe are starting to get back to work and they don't have sufficient amount of money primarily to either rent an apartment or to buy an apartment. And as far as hotels construction, I think that's going to have a dramatic impact as well. Because as you can see, I think a lot of people are afraid to travel. The airline industry was dramatically impacted by what's happening. A lot of people don't want to travel primarily, and I think that you're going to see a drastic reduction in the number of people primarily who want to basically travel, go to a major city and stay overnight. I think there's going to be concern about that. And I think, again, I don't have my crystal ball, so this is my thinking about this. I think this is going to take a long period of time. I think, obviously, everybody is hoping for a vaccine that's going to basically get rid of this coronavirus. And I think when that happens, I think that you're going to find a dramatic change of what happens with high-rise residential and hotel construction as well. But I think it's going to be a period of time. And this happened primarily after the 2008, 2009 recession that we had. I think this is more extensive, to tell you the truth, than what happened during that period of time, because this is going to last longer. At least with the 2008, 2009 recession, you knew that there was an end in sight. And even with that end in sight, it took the construction industry and all the other industries a long period of time to recover. I think this is going to be a longer period. One other thing, oh, well, okay. Do you think, Ira? Yeah, okay. I think affordable housing and infrastructure project, I think as far as the mayor is concerned, he's trying to push affordable housing and infrastructure projects. I think those are going to continue. I really do. I think part of the problem that we're going to be faced with those projects, the city's not going to have the money. The city right now has a major problem of financing the basic services that it's going to need. And they're going to start looking at ways to reduce costs. And I think, unfortunately, ways they're going to find to reduce costs is by reducing the amount of affordable housing that they're going to have. Right? So I hope that answered that question. Is there a possibility that will be more city architecture developments in cities such as Brooklyn, Jersey City, and Hoboken? I think all the cities, all the major cities of the US are going to be faced with the same problems that we have here in New York City. A lot of the projects in those particular locations were faced primarily with a lot of the protocol and delays in construction that we've had. And I think that they're going to be faced with the same problems that we have here in New York City. There was a pent-up demand in especially Jersey City and Hoboken, where there was a lot of work that was starting. My own feeling is that I think there's going to be a slowdown. I think those projects that have started are going to be completed, but I think that the banks, the financial institutions are going to look hard to find out the viability of adding more stock to the existing environment that you may have in Jersey City and Hoboken. So here we have something. Do you think overall profit potential in future developments will decrease due to reasons such as potential increase in material and construction costs? How do you think this will be mitigated? So when you look at a project from a developer's perspective, a developer has to prepare a document that primarily states what that return is going to be to that particular developer. It's called a pro forma. A pro forma is a document talking about the total cost of the project, the hard and soft costs, which is presented to a financial institution. The financial institution reviews and evaluates those costs to find out if in fact the project is viable or not. What I believe is going to happen in the future, the near future, is that the cost of construction are going to escalate. And what's going to happen because of that scenario, that developers, in order to make sure that their performers are going to be viable, may have to increase the cost, whether it be their rental cost or their cost for purchasing apartments or what have you. However, on the plus side, and this may change depending upon the scenario, is that some of the developers' costs are now coming down and have come down. The interest rate have come down somewhat. So their cost of money has been reduced. Whether in fact one balances the other, the cost of interest versus the increase of construction costs, can only be determined by the developer after they do their pro formas for a particular project. So I think what's going to happen in the future, that in general, I believe that construction costs are going to have an impact on development. I think that financial institutions are going to take a strong look at the viability of a project, and I think it's going to be more stringent, and the number of projects, I think, are going to be reduced to somewhat. Justin, did that answer the question? Justin? All right, anybody else? James, there are some people raising their hand.
We have one person raising her hand. I will allow them to talk.
Okay. Yes, what is the question?
So my question is similar to modular construction style, which we typically do, and which typically also involves shipping, huge logistics from different states or different countries. How about breaking a construction contract group into two labor forces? One which does prefab or a major part of the prefabbing process in a different urban site nearby.
Okay, so I'll answer that question because I know the answer already.
Right.
Are you familiar with the Atlantic Yards project in Brooklyn?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so a developer was going to use modular construction to build a 33-story high-rise residential unit. And there was a factory in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Brooklyn Navy Yard, it was a huge industrial complex during the Second World War. It's converted now to the use by private businesses primarily. Just what you said was happening there, that they had a factory environment, they had a separate group of workers that fabricated the modular units. Those modular units were trucked to the site, which was only about a mile away from where the factory was located. And then they installed those particular components on the job site. And this is being used at other locations as well, where you have two workforces, the workforce that works in the factory and the workforce that works on the job site. So that is being done here in the US right now as we speak.
Yes. So I've been part of multiple projects out here in New York, and because some of these projects I've done were institutional projects, and they had that kind of funds to break it and the management to do that. But my question—
No, you're wrong. The the Atlantic Yards project was a developer with his own money and financing himself. It was not a government project.
Okay. My question was in reference, is it viable to do the same model of management for, let's say, small asset class developers, like multifamily buildings? Is it possible to break that in that?
There was, again, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, there was a modular fabricator, all right? What that individual was producing, he produced two things. One, as you said, low-income housing, which was for the government, and the second one was for housing. As a matter of fact, I know an individual who used that particular factory to construct a hotel out on the east end of Long Island. So yes, it is possible to do that.
Thank you.
Okay. James, anybody else?
I think we have one more question that popped up.
Okay.
Hi, are there any jobs that used to be out in the regular world, which will now be working remotely besides the usual APM, PM secretary and estimating due to coronavirus?
Well, I think that a lot of businesses are looking at how they could remote a lot of their workforce. By remoting their workforce primarily, they're reducing primarily the amount of square footage that they have to rent. I mean, one of the areas that I could think of in the construction environment, several things. Number one is doing requisitions from afar. You don't need to be in an office to do the requisitions. The requisitions are submitted to you, you review and evaluating it. Purchasing is another way to do it. Maybe reviewing and evaluating bids that come in primarily can be done remotely. I think there is a whole list of things in putting a TCO together and getting all the documentation that's required to obtain your TCO. Does not have to be done on a job site or in an office environment. It can be done remotely. So there are a lot of jobs that primarily were done in an office environment that if in fact contractors are now looking at ways to save costs, they can now do it remotely. And very easily, because with computers and everything else, the documentation can be transferred via the computer from an individual, say in an office, to somebody who's doing it remotely. So yes, I think there's a lot of opportunity for contractors to evaluate their workforce and see how they can reduce the number of people that they're providing for in an office versus doing it off-site or in their home.
And there'll be, I'm sorry. And there will be a lot less people to be hired now that we have the coronavirus and the financial impact, correct?
I don't know, Michelle. Could be.
Okay.
I don't
So
have my crystal ball. I wish I did.
Basically just look for, basically look for ways to make everything efficient, take into effect of the new rules of coronavirus,
Right.
and then like you said, the staggering of work staff and sanitizing everything.
Well, when you look at even people coming to an office, all right, when you look at people coming to the office, you're going to have to establish new protocol. You're going to have separation. By having separation, maybe your desks are further apart. By having your desks further apart, it means that the square footage that you're going to rent increases, all right? So in order to avoid that, you try to get as much people as possible working remotely.
Makes sense.
Okay. I think that's about it. I want to thank everybody. I hope you got something out of it. And number one, be safe, please. Make sure you wear masks when you go outside and make sure you keep your distance. But most of all, try to be safe, okay? Thank you very much for listening into this seminar. I hope you got something out of it.